Okay, it is 11. So you know what? We will get started. I want to honor our time. Um, Thank you and welcome to session 3 of our 4-part series, From the Inside Out, Building Resilience for a Vital Future. So glad to have you here with us again. We are talking about community resilience today. Before we do that, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So the communities in Halton region, as we know them today, are abundant in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis, from the Anishinaabe to the Attawandaron, the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and the Métis. These lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history. This territory is mutually covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy, the Ojibwe, and other allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. As we gather today on these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to honor and respect the 4 directions: land, waters, plants, animals, ancestors that walked before us, and all of the wonderful elements of creation that exist. And as always, we invite you to locate yourself via native-land.ca. So this week we will explore the concept of community resilience. You know, last week we talked about individual resilience, and we're kind of making the connection between individual, community, and the next week's systems resilience. And you know, how to recognize and tap into it, how to tell when it's low, and to consider community resilience building strategies from different perspectives. And joining me as always are Anna, Kiani, Kale Black, and our special guest this week, Jackie Prime, whom Kale will introduce in a few minutes. So to start this off, I think, you know, we each wanted to share a quick reflection from our perspective, and we're changing up the format a little bit for today's session. I wanted to share a reflection. I was watching David Letterman. He has a show on Netflix right now, and he did an interview with the comedian Dave Chappelle recently. And I was watching the interview, and I just heard some profound ideas around his idea of community, and just he shared kind of an adverse journey he had, and how he felt like, you know, we don't appreciate the value of community until we need community. So I think about my own context. I come from a South Asian background where, you know, community was kind of the priority over the individual. And of course, growing up in Canada, the tension between kind of my heritage and kind of the message here around kind of individual first. And so it just made me think that we tend to think we can do things on our own. And so that message around, sometimes we don't realize, you know, what the value of a community till we're, you know, in need of community. And I can think of my own life experiences where there were times in my life where I'm like, my community totally carried me in that point in my life, whatever was going on. And he talks about the idea of like that money insulates people from their need for each other. That racism, I would argue, also insulates people from their need for each other. And Chappelle talked about that he did 26 shows over the last several months, in the time of COVID in Ohio, where he grew up. And he said that it was important to him that he wanted his work to truly benefit local people. So he did these outdoor shows, and he employed so many people locally. So he was able to affect his community and support their resilience. And I just think about, he has one more quick quote I want to share, that he said, like, you know, we walked past a toilet paper roll and left it there because we had one at home, and that it stayed on the shelf longer that way because we knew there was enough. And he's like, you have to believe in something, otherwise there's just no point. And so it brings me kind of, I'll conclude my comments with a quote from Meg Wheatley that, you know, whatever the problem, community is the answer. So that's kind of my reflection on that. So Anna.
Every week I forget to unmute. As I've mentioned previously, I come from a background of both community development and disaster and emergency management. And those two fields of practice actually align very, very well. Historically, probably about 50 or 60 years ago, disaster and emergency management was very much a realm of kind of militarized command and control. It was based on top-down structures where something would happen and then people would show up to save the day. And usually those people were the army or the military. And in the past few decades, the field of practice has really come to understand that that managing crisis, disaster, and emergency is really based on reducing risk in community by increasing community resilience. So you focus on the community before anything and build out from there, as opposed to top down. You start with a community and move upwards and out from there. So in doing that, the focus is really understanding what makes a community resilient and then enhancing that. And that means it has to be place-based. It has to be really focused on the unique nature of every community. So that can mean as small as your neighborhood and all the way out to the municipality around you, and sometimes beyond to you can focus on it as your country as well. But really starting on that small network and building out from there. So that has a lot of implications to systems and how you create systems that can reflect that. But really, the starting point is really understanding community. So I'm really excited that Jackie's here today because she's going to kind of explore that from the perspective of an anthropologist, which in our next session, I'll really be able to build out from that and understanding how you do that at a systems level. So I think Kale, I'll pass it to Kale, who will explore his perspective a bit, and then we'll be able to hear from Jackie.
I want to be, thank you so much, Anna. I want to be as brief as possible so I can hand the screen over to our fantastic guest speaker. But I talk a lot about personal resiliency and all of the aspects that are so important with that. And what I've recognized and learned over the years is that there really isn't personal resiliency is completely intertwined with community resiliency. And it can be very, very difficult to be a personally resilient person unless you have access to like a healthy and thriving community. And what was really great, or one of the things that was really great about that feeling and experience being echoed back in a lot of the things that Dr. Jackie Prime teaches about, and about anthropology and about sort of where we come from as humans and our history as primates. And primates need this community creatures, and that they need it to survive, and that humans are not different or separate from the other animals on the planet. Although, like we said, sort of money or influence can insulate us from sort of what we might not understand are our core needs as humans. So being able to understand and learn from that lens has been extremely helpful, from a place of just acceptance and knowledge of knowing that humans are primates and we have certain needs, and community is not an option. And that's sort of like a scientific fact and foundation that has tons of resources and research behind it. So I would love to introduce my good friend and colleague, Dr. Jackie Prime, and I'm going to read a little bit about her bio and then say something that I feel like after, probably. So Dr. Jackie Prime is the founder of Prime Earth and has dedicated her life's work to making the world a more inclusive, accepting, and understanding place. Growing up in Burlington, Jackie was interested in wildlife, nature, and human relationships from a young age. But it wasn't until a fateful trip to Thailand in grad school that her calling for and passion for people, primates, community, and conservation began to flourish. Armed with some research equipment, a video camera, and a solid pair of hiking boots, Jackie left her comfortable Burlington home knowing only one thing for sure. Living alone on the other side of the world would not be a walk on the park. Relying on the kindness of strangers, she would need to learn the local language fast and make new friends in order to survive life in the jungle. It was a task that put her strength, mental ingenuity, and psyche to the ultimate test, leading her to discover a lot about the endangered animals she studies, but even more about the intrinsic value of life and what it means to be a human. Now, with over a decade of teaching and researching experience, studying the intelligence and behaviors of human and non-human primates, Jackie is one of the few dedicated gibbon specialists in the world, as well as a seasoned personal empowerment coach and a children's book author. Sharing her story and knowledge with others to inspire, empower, and engage people to become active participants in a global society that respects and reveres nature, human diversity, and our planet. So another note is I need to work on my bio because it is not as dynamic and fantastic as that one. But I had the pleasure of meeting Jackie through my work with Burlington Green, and we've been working and volunteering together for several years since then. And I can say wholeheartedly, definitely one of the most brilliant minds I have ever come across here on the planet. And brilliant in the way that it weaves together the science of anthropology with creating a kinder and compassionate world. And it can seem like a little bit separate, but what I have learned is it is all connected and weaves beautifully through the magic of science. So I am very happy and pleased to hand the screen over to Dr. Jackie Prime. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting me here today. I'm happy to be here and excited to talk with everyone. I guess I'll start. I'm not sure if everyone knows a lot about anthropology. Most people I meet don't, or they say like anthropology is complicated, and they sort of leave it at that. So they know what it is, but they think it's too complicated. So I quickly will just say, so anthropology at the very basic level is the study of humans. And it's broken down in North America, it's broken down into a couple different avenues because humans, as you all know, and probably you have discussed multiple times in the past couple of weeks with these meetings, humans are very complex. We're very complicated. There's a lot of us and we do things differently in a lot of different places. And so anthropology in North America is divided into cultural anthropology, which focuses on how people understand the world and how we interact with the world and perceive ourselves in relation to the world. And then there's biological anthropology, which looks at how we are connected to the world, how our bodies are shaped, what human variation is and what it means through all periods of time. So from way back when animals first started walking on 2 feet all the way up until today. And then there's archaeology, which looks at the garbage and the leftovers of people from the past and tries to understand what past populations were like and lived like. And then there's linguistics, which looks at gestural communication and oral communication. And so in biological anthropology, there's a very small percentage of people who don't actually study humans in great detail at all, and they study non-human primates, and that's what I fit into. And the reason why we study non-human primates is because as humans, we fit in with the natural world by being connected to a set of other animals who share the same characteristics as us. And the characteristics that we share as primates sort of play into all the stuff we're talking about here today. So primates as a group have a couple things that make us distinctly different from all other animals on Earth. One of the first things is our brains tend to be larger and a little more complicated than most other mammals. In addition to that, we have a couple features like forward-facing eyes with depth perception. There are other animals that have that, but all of us have it together as a group that's different from many others. The outside of our eye sockets are closed. So other animals like horses or dogs, the outside of their eye sockets are not closed. But if you press on the sides of your temples, you'll feel bone there. And that's a uniquely primate trait. All of that makes vision and visual communication and visual stimulation extremely important to us, which is unlike many other animals where scent is the primary sense that's important. And then a few other things, we all have fingernails, we don't have claws. We all have relatively varied teeth. We don't all have very big, sharp canines and sharp molars or grinding teeth. So animals that are herbivores have grinding teeth that move like this. Animals that are carnivores have a whole set of extremely sharp teeth, but primates have Some of us have sharp canines, but all of us have sort of like berry teeth, which means that we can eat a varied diet. We can eat nuts and seeds. We can chew meat up. We can eat fruits and leaves. And all of that is important when we're talking about resilience, because all of those features mean that we really are terrible creatures when it comes to living on our own. If you think about humans in relation to something that is meant to be independent, like a polar bear or a tiger, polar bears have huge claws, they have very thick skin, they have extremely sharp teeth. So they're designed physically to be able to protect themselves and to withstand harsh conditions or attacks from predators or live on their own. Humans don't have that capacity at all, right? I mean, like paper can cut us because our skin is so thin. We definitely, you know, like our nails tear, we can bite our own nails and chew them off. They're not sharp. We could never, ever attack anything with our fingers. And so really the only way that primates survive in this world is by sticking together and by forming communities. And so that is one of the unique primate traits that ties in with all of our physical traits that make us hardwired for connection and cooperation and for community structures, where we need to learn a little bit about how to be who we are by interacting with our community and helping us survive. So the kind of stuff that I'm interested in and talking about with resilience and things like that is sort of delving into one of the things that makes us unique as humans and separates us from other primates is that we definitely have a capacity for resilience that far exceeds any other primate and most other species on the planet. And so for most other animals, they have very specific niches that they fit into in their ecosystems. And if you think about monkeys and apes and the common, you know, chimpanzees or gorillas or macaques, animals that you might have seen at the zoo or heard of, they all live in tropical zones. So close to the equator, in the subtropics, that's where most primates survive. And humans are the only primate that is able to expand out of that and who has adapted to all different kinds of extreme environments. So we live in very arid environments, we live in tropical forests, we also live in Arctic regions, we live in cold climates, we live in seasonal climates. And all of that is possible because we have adapted culturally by working together and cooperating with each other and sharing our knowledge. And most importantly, taking care of each other. And really that is all about resilience. Our ability to take care of each other is paramount to our survival as individuals and then as a species that has allowed us to expand and become extremely prolific all around the entire planet. So I said a lot of things. If you guys have questions and you want to start diving into that, then I'm open to answering questions or to talking more about it. But that's sort of my perspective on resiliency.
I have just a question to get sort of things going. And I just got to ask first, so is I was always very interested in the discussion about how like our biological sort of rhythms are still set just naturally in that primate sort of mode that affects a lot of our decisions and how we interact with people. And one of the things I loved hearing about was how that natural drive affects how we interact with other people based on like the subconscious knowledge that we need them. So I would just be interested if you would be able to expand on that and maybe say that a little bit more articulately than I just did.
Talking about our innate nature, like our innate need for
like humans' decision making and how we interact with each other and how our biology actually influences, or our DNA influences that a lot more than most people are conscious of.
Yeah, so based on a lot of the things I just talked about, some of our physical features were, because we know that we are physically incapable of defending ourselves in most environments, we know and have an innate drive to connect with others and to form pods with others so that we have other people around us to protect us. And so that's an innate need that humans need for survival, is they need companionship and they need connection. And so there have been studies, it's common in all primates, humans just take it to another level. So we know from studies, some unfortunately terrible studies that were done in the 60s where psychologists took infant monkeys and they put them, like newborns, they took them away from their mothers and then they put them into different scenarios to see what would happen. And every single time the infants that were taken away, given food and water, but not given affection and touch and love, instantly died within a week, like every single time. And then all the other animals that had some level of connection and some level of affection survived. So the individuals that had like moderate affection and moderate connection with caregivers, they ended up surviving, but they had psychological issues as they got older, and they had problems interacting with other monkeys and other animals and other people as they got older. And then the animals that were given the normal amount of, stayed with their mothers cared for them, they had the affection that they needed, they all ended up growing up to be well integrated animals in their captive setting. And humans are the same way. If you don't have that connection with others around you, then it's something that you cannot fully provide for yourself, and you end up suffering significantly from it. So it's hardwired in our systems to connect with each other and to need that sense of community. And, societies that there's no, I don't want to say there or try to give a comparison that there's any society of humans right now that's doing things better than the rest. Because every society, every way we've managed to group ourselves in history has had pluses and minuses. We've never gotten it 100% perfect yet, but definitely societies that focus more on the group and putting the needs of the group ahead of the individual have a much better sense of resiliency and a much better ability to handle disasters and problems than the societies like Western societies that focus very heavily on the individual. And there's lots of research coming out about mental health differences and the different kinds of physical ailments that people get in societies where community is the focus versus the individual is the focus. And always, the societies that have the individual as the focus tend to have like greater problems with mental health, greater rates of suicide, greater rates of certain kinds of physical ailments, because humans are designed to connect with each other. And when you're in a Western society that tells you the individual is more important and you should be able to do it on your own and you should be able to get through this and just power through, that doesn't always line up with our nature and our biology. And so that can be, that can cause a real disconnect internally for the individual who needs connection to be hearing and thinking like, oh, I should be able to get through this on my own. I should be doing better because society tells me that. And that, I think, is a disconnect that comes from our cultural history and our cultural ideology in Western culture specifically.
It's very interesting how people's like minds or sort of programmed beliefs can say one thing, but like your biology is literally saying something else, and you can't really ignore the biological aspect that this is a human need.
Yeah.
That we have. It's not just love and affection is nice. Like, it is the foundation of community, of personal resilience, community resilience, planetary resilience. Very, very interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's our, like, Western society has a history of like a fairly recent history in the last several hundred years of what do I want to say? Like a religious system imposing the idea of like a top down, that like there's a God that tells you how to behave, and then you're better than all the animals, and then you can make everything into a hierarchy and things like that. And I'm not saying that there isn't a God or there isn't creation or there isn't something like that. But when you put things into a hierarchy, instead of looking at how you are connected to the environment and how like you're part of the system, then it really creates that disconnect, and it creates that sense of my nature is telling me this, but my brain is overriding and saying I should be doing it this way. And then it creates a disconnect that's very difficult. And so it's important, I think, for people to realize, regardless of how we got here, we're all connected to each other. And so being connected means that we have to think of ourselves not as separate from animals, not as separate from different groups of people, not as separate from the environment, but as part of a whole functioning system. And I think that's where, like, when it comes to resilience and community resilience and individual resilience, there's no way around it. You have to get like the group working together, in with the environment, in with each other, in order to be able to overcome some of the hardships and like crazy disasters that happen on the planet. We have to work together in order to survive.
Thank you for that, Jackie. So insightful, and just kind of, I think it resonates with some of the themes we've explored in other sessions. We were talking before this, and I was curious about, we're in this time of, COVID, and it has me thinking about like the story we're telling ourselves, or the story that's being fed to us. So both ways, what story are we telling ourselves about how we're doing? I was talking about, like, I have a neighbor across the street who, she's 82 years old, and she's telling me stories about having to live in the forest during the war in Europe because she's Polish. And how there's an element of taking things in stride that, because this is big for us, for our generation, in terms of this experience. And I don't want to make light of it, but I'm very interested in the story we're telling ourselves and the stories we're told about what success looks like. And whose success is profiled. So I think about, the article you shared with us, and maybe we'll share the article in the chat here, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, around kind of what does, just to spotlight some resilience that you've shared with us that really hasn't made it to mainstream kind of consciousness.
Yeah, I think, so in my experience, I grew up in Burlington, and I lived here most of my life. And then for grad school, I went to the United States, and I did grad school in Southern Illinois, and I was there for 10 years. And then part of that 10 years, I moved to Thailand for a couple of years, where I was studying the animals that I study. So I've lived in I've lived in some interesting places where Canada and the US are very similar in many ways. But there are some stark differences in the way we understand who we are. And then both of these places are very much in stark contrast to Thailand. It's totally different, totally different over there. But at the same time, all these places are made up of humans. We all share the same emotions. We all have sort of similar experiences. We go through things, and our lens of understanding where we fit in the world is slightly different versus if you're Canadian or American or Thailand. And one of the big differences is that Canadians are independent, but we still have some sense of a group connection. We're proud Canadians. We like to wear our maple leaves on our jackets and our hats. And, when we're advertising, it's always like made in Canada or like proudly Canadian. Like we have a sense of that here. Americans are very, very independent. No matter what, the individual is the most important, which is why you're seeing this whole response to COVID. There was much more backlash in the US towards not wearing masks and the government telling them what to do. And then people calling it a hoax and blaming other people, because they think like, I'm the individual, and so I'm invincible to what's going on. And that's like filtered into every single thing. And so the best example I can give is, maybe you had this experience, but when I was younger and I would go out with my friends, like in university or high school, if we would go somewhere like to the movies or to a party or to a bar, 9 times out of 10, if 5 people went together, 5 people came home together. And if one of those people didn't come home together, you knew when that person left, why they left, how they got home. So everybody was aware of their friends and keeping it together. In the States, it was never like that. 5 people would go together and then they would sort of disappear, and people would go home and not tell you that your friends left. Like suddenly I would find myself like completely alone at the bar, and I would be like, wait a minute, I'm by myself here. Like, why are my friends not here to help me get home? And that's really the difference between that independent mentality, that like the individual, like I don't need to tell my friends where I'm going, versus in Canada being like, oh, I'm just going to check in with my friends and tell them that I'm going here. And both of those societies are in total stark contrast to Thailand, where in Thailand, like people just walk in and out of each other's houses. So I was in a rural community in Thailand where most of the population were people who were not well educated. Most of them had to stop going to school around the age of like 10. One of my friends, the friend I had who stayed in school the longest had to stay could stay until she was 13. And then when they get to that age, 10 to 13, they needed to leave school so that they could help their families with working fields, with selling products, with trying to make some kind of living to help support the family. So, those rural communities really focus on working together and being all connected in order to survive. And so their community structures are very much like people would just walk into their houses when they need things. People would bring things over all the time. Like they would say, like, you know, when I first moved in, my neighbor used to come over, and she would one day she just handed me like 2 duck eggs and a wine cooler. And I was like, okay, thank you. And like at that point, I didn't really speak Thai very well. So I was just like, oh, I have some duck eggs and a wine cooler. But they were just like, these are extra things I have, so I'm bringing them to you because you just got here and you probably don't have any duck eggs and wine coolers right now. So here you go. And so the reason why I'm talking all about all of that is because our society really focuses on, with the idea that the individual is important. It's apparent in Canada, but not to the extreme that it is in the US. But it really shapes the way we understand what the response to COVID should be and how we should react to disaster situations. And it's quite different from Thailand. So Thailand has one of the best responses, and they have one of the lowest they have an almost 0 rate of transmission and almost 0 rate of deaths, like doing far better than the rest of us on the Western world, on this side of the world, simply because the community is more important and the community is responding to the events. When we put the individual ahead of everyone else, then you get this like tension between like, I want to do it one way and I want to do it the other way. When in this particular situation with a pandemic, it's so obvious that the only way to handle disease transmission, which I'll just throw in, is one of the few like threats to human species is diseases. You know, we don't easily get eaten by lions and, you know, run over by mammoths anymore. Like saber-toothed tigers are not a threat for us. So disease and disease transmission is one of the few things that can completely wipe out our population. That's all based on taking care of each other. So handling, like taking care of the people who are sick, but then also like changing our behaviors to make sure that we're not transmitting the disease to each other. And that article that you were talking about, Leena, talks about the societies that came together and rallied as communities are doing like far better at tackling the issues, at eradicating the problems, at handling the disease transmission. And they're not getting talked about in Western media, which is what that particular article is about. So like Vietnam has only 35 deaths total in all of Vietnam with the COVID. Like Sri Lanka, Mongolia was the country that has had the best response. They had 0 deaths and they had 0 transmission. Sri Lanka just completely shut down, totally shut down. No debate about what can be open and what can't be open. They just shut down completely. Cleared the problem and then reopened and they were fine. They have no problems with COVID, but we're not hearing about any of that stuff in our Western world because of racism and systemic problems with race in our media coverage. We're not talking about the countries that we might think are underdeveloped or who are poorer nations and how they're handling it. We're just talking about, you know, like New Zealand is doing a great job, which they absolutely are, but they're more like us, so we can relate, like New Zealand and Canada, and understanding how they're doing things. But man, if we did what Mongolia was doing, or if we did what Sri Lanka was doing, which is what I was saying from the beginning, like, why are we not just all staying in our houses for a little while? Like, stop everything and then bring it back, instead of trying to weigh like economic concerns over life. We would handle things so much better. And unfortunately, we haven't really done that here. And it comes down to the way we view the world, and in thinking that the individual has so much power that they may be invincible, or that they're expendable in a way that the community doesn't always, that a community perspective does not always view the world that way.
I think a part of what we're seeing play out in what you're describing is that there are multiple dimensions to how community resilience is tapped in the face of crisis and disasters and emergencies. And there's the individual resilience, there's the community resilience, and then there's the systems resilience. And what we see in our North American context is there's the focus on the individual is strong, and the focus on the system is strong, but there's something in the middle there that's missing, and that is the community dynamic. And so what we see in societies that maybe are not as resource rich as the North American context, there is, especially in places where there's some dimension of systems, and there is some infrastructure, and there is some individual resilience, but then there's that strong binding element of the community that also exists. Yeah. It brings it all together. So that need for high resource is not, it's just not as required as we may think it is. If you have a strong community dimension, it can actually bridge the individual, the community, and the system, and pull it all together. Yeah.
Wonderful. Are there any questions from the audience? I think we have a smaller group today, so I'm wondering if
Maya's got a question.
I do.
Perfect. I just wanted to say we're probably not going to do breakouts because we're in a smaller group today. So if you're all okay, we'll just take some questions. It's a gift to have Dr. Prime here. So go ahead, Maya.
Oh, thank you. I was just reading an article yesterday about Iceland's response to COVID, which was quite informative because they have the same kind of thing as New Zealand, like a isolated kind of community, but at the same time, their approach, I guess it's more homogenous in that community. But their response was quite interesting from a community perspective and from an actual thoroughly scientific perspective as well.
Yeah. Is there any parts of that, Maya, that you want to elaborate on in terms of, if you kind of, just for us, if we have?
Oh, sure. There were, well, some of my takeaways, and I will admit I read it, but I didn't maybe absorb all of the content, was pretty much right away they entered into a public-private partnership, and one of their partners did genomic sequencing. So they also tested half of their population, which is, I think, 375,000 people. And in that process, they've discovered a lot of, or clarified a lot of the uncertainties that are associated with this disease in terms of the symptoms that you actually have, which are actually quite different than the CDC was putting forward, and lots of other things to do with follow-up and, let me think, I guess, yeah, challenging a lot of the assumptions that were going along with how that pathogen was. So, but what I found was the cooperation from the citizenry was also really great.
Awesome. So it kind of, it validates what we're talking about here in terms of the innate need for collaboration, for partnership, and, just to.
And I know Iceland, just like I have traveled there, it was one of the closest knit communities I could have ever imagined. Literally, it's one big family on an island. And it blew my mind the way that they think about nature, that every single citizen is so passionate about protecting their environment. You can go to any stream or creek in Iceland and fill up a water bottle and drink it. And I don't know why that blows my mind so much. And they were laughing at us like, oh, Canadians with your poison water. Like the simplest things that make sense. They don't poison their water. They don't poison their air. They protect their natural spaces. They care for and love each other. Community. And like, holy crap, you can see the resilience that sort of levels up to in so many different ways.
Yeah. I would argue that one of the potential reasons for that disconnect in our society between the individual and the systemic and the community in between that is missing has to do with the long history of racism and colonialism in our communities. I can speak to Thailand because I have experience living there, that the majority of Thai people are sort of like all the same. There's a small population of Muslims in the south, and there is conflict between the Muslims and the Buddhists in Thailand. But I think the Muslims make up, but don't quote me on this number, but I want to say they make up 8% of the community. And so when like 92% of your community believes that they're all the same, it's much more easy to say we're all in this together because we're all the same. When you get into a situation like we're in Canada, where you have a variety of people that are coming from all different places, and there's a history of thinking that this group looks different from me, this group behaves different from me, and therefore they are not like me, that creates a tension that creates a tension. I feel like that sounded like one word. That creates a tension that creates this disconnect in, when I say community, I mean these people and not those people. And then you get to, it comes over. So then the jump from the individual passing over the community to the system is, I mean, our system is very much in favor of particular kind of person in Canada. And there are people in Canada who the system does not favor at all. And they struggle, even though we have wonderful amenities in our country, there are people that don't have access to those amenities. And I think that's the problem. When we don't think of ourselves as all connected and as one group, and if we think of our differences as something that to fear or to be judgmental of, then it creates this problem where the system doesn't work for everyone, and the community ends up becoming little pods instead of pods, sometimes working against each other instead of everyone working together to combat disasters, and then to provide a better level of resilience to problems. I think all of that is tied in with racism.
So you're speaking to my heart for sure. And I've been thinking, over COVID, like when you look at where transmission is high, and I'll talk about my local context, like Brampton, Ontario is a spot that seems to be getting, there's higher transmission. And I've heard anecdotally amongst people like this judgment of, oh, they just like this idea that it's like, it's too many of these super spreader weddings, or it's these things. And like, I've really heard some interesting dialogue around, look at the makeup of Brampton, for example, as an essential services. Look at who is disproportionately affected. Look at, they're a hub for deliveries, all these Amazon orders that have just spiked through the roof because people just need things to cope. And so I've been really happy to hear some of I don't know how widespread the narrative is, but just that, it should be us against the problem, whatever that problem is, rather than this idea. And I take that approach with racism as well. Like, it needs to be us against racism. It's not like racism is racialized people's problem. It's everybody's problem, because these issues, even things like, low income or like income insecurity, food insecurity, housing insecurity, the community is feeling we all feel it when there is, there's a disproportional, like if only certain pockets of community have resilience and others don't have that access because of inequity, we all are paying for that to some degree. And I'm hoping that that's something we all leave this experience with, that we need to be worried about not just ourselves, how can we prepare ourselves so when this happens again, we're going to have a different experience, like not just around, getting a vaccine. Of course, that's important, all those pieces. I hope that like one of the legacies is that we're looking at inequity differently. We're looking at disproportionality, that we're, you know, that it's all, we're seeing the connections.
Somebody direct messaged me a question that I'm going to try to answer, but then would like to also pass off to Jackie and the rest of you to see what your thoughts are. So the question was, you talked about the individual and systems resilience being strong while community is suffering. Can all three be equally strong, i.e. does a strong community reduce the need for individual resilience? I think my answer to this would be that it's not, that there's a flowing nature to it, that it can go from individual to community to systems, and there are different times where the need for resilience from one of those lenses increases. In a really practical sense, though, I think my instinct that a strong community does reduce the need for individual resilience, because if you look at the idea of a strong system, I feel like a strong system is further removed from the individual, whereas a strong community is closer, and in a sense, the individual is immersed in a strong community, whereas it may be that the system sort of operates at the periphery of the individual. So if a community is strong, then an individual is closely attached to that community, then I think, yes, it can reduce the requirement of the individual to consistently have so much resilience, because it's close, you're better able to tap into the resilience of a community rather than a big system. I don't know if Jackie or Kale or Leena, anybody else had a thought on that?
I actually think I actually think it's kind of the other way around from my perspective, because I think of that, you know, community. I mentioned this last night, that a community is not a standalone thing, and a system is not a standalone thing. They're all based on the individual. So at the center of everything is the human being. And then how we as human beings group ourselves together is the community. And then the rules that we all agree to abide by and function by is the system. And so this system in the community is very much able to fluctuate with whatever the individuals at the center of it want and want to do. And so I think that it's not possible to have a strong community without or to have a strong community that wouldn't require resilient individuals, because the whole purpose of the community providing resilience is instilling in every generation and the younger generations how to be resilient and improve on what's going on. And so I think that, like, in a scenario where you have like these three levels, that they're all connected, but also they all revolve around the individuals who comprise the larger components. If you have a society, in my mind, of individuals, I know I mentioned this before, that I mentioned it last night, not for everyone, but if you have like one individual who has a high level of resilience, and that individual is able to rally the rest of the troops and get everyone in the community to form a resilient community, then everyone has become raised up to the same level of resilience. And now they're feeding the system to be improving for future generations, so that everyone is thinking from the point of resilience to start with. And then it's just, that's what life is. Now you're able to tackle like bigger problems as life keeps hitting you down with them, because that's how the universe sort of works, right? You overcome a problem and you get a small level of resiliency, and then something bigger comes along and you have to rise up to the occasion again. And I think even dealing with this COVID thing, it's a great example comparing Canada and the US. When we in Toronto specifically were hit with H1N1, we were dealing with a coronavirus. The COVID-19 is the same kind of virus as the H1N1. It dramatically impacted our population. Our hospitals were overloaded. They were dealing with crazy situations. From that, they put a bunch of protocols in place. The US watched what was happening. George Bush made statements saying we should put these protocols in place in case this ever happens. The US didn't put any of those protocols in place. In the GTA, at least I know, they did put those protocols in place. So when the COVID-19 came, we weren't doing the best job ever, but we were better able to respond right away compared to the US, who was like, oh my God, like this has never happened before. And it was like, oh my gosh, this has happened so many times in history. You just aren't learning from what happened before.
I love all of this. And I have to say this series has actually had me really revisit my own ideas. And I can't say I've landed in a place definitively, but I think something that's alive for me is this idea of threshold, that in a community, I think there has to be a threshold of enough individuals who have resilience to carry where there isn't. And I think about the experience of like becoming a parent. Like when I had my child, like that's an instance where I'm like, my community carried me, because it was just in terms of I had different complications and just thinking about, you know, it was a gift that others weren't all in that same boat at the same time, because then we would just be like, how do we help each other? So just this idea of if there's enough wellness or resilience in the community, then we can take the shocks, you know. But if more and more of the community is compromised, then we have less capacity. So I see both very, you know, kind of how we, like what we said at the outset, that they're very intertwined. And I continue to kind of, I can't even say that I prioritize one over the other. But I appreciate this conversation very much.
My thoughts on it too, very similar. It's almost sort of like, depending on where you are, like it sounds like in Thailand, it is like a very healthy, robust community that does sort of not eliminate, but reduce some of the personal need for resilience, because you have that community sort of safety net and bubble and like check-in system, where here it's, like I feel like we have a lot of retroactive work to do, like some catch-up work in terms of the individual resilience that we each need to contribute to get to that point of community sort of safety and being able to be held. Because as we mentioned today, there's a lot of things that most of our society, I'd say here in North America, is unaware that needs to be deprogrammed. In order for us to have those healthy communities. And it's that like that legacy of things like systemic racism or injustice, or the entire process of colonization. And a lot of those ideas and beliefs and ways of thinking and understanding and relating are buried in our subconsciouses, just because of like how we've been brought up by our families, the kind of media we've been consuming, how we witness things interacting with each other. So it's like our personal contributions to unprogram and rewire our own brains are what is building that healthy community system now. And I know even someone like myself who's constantly trying to like question and learn, I'm still catching myself and like, wow, that was really like subtly racist. And I had it just popped into my brain. Like that was a thought that just was sort of there. But like I said before, like awareness creates choice, choice creates change, that like as we're able to witness those behaviors and those patterns and we're able to clear them, our community gets stronger and stronger, which will, I'm sure, eventually lead to that point where you can not coast on the capacity of community, but you can rely on it a little bit more, because we've cleared out some of that old garbage and trauma that's just been rolling over the generations and the continent.
Thank you for that. So we have, I wonder if there's any more questions from our participants today. I did put a question for reflection around, you know, as you think about in the chat, as you think about community, what do you believe that you give to community? And what do you feel you receive from community to support your individual resilience? So, you know, thinking about the connection between the two, just a reflection. And I think about this concept of social capital as well. I think it's Robert Putnam had a book that came out in the I think in the 90s, it's Bowling Alone, and it really is an American context-focused book, but just the idea of how, from my background being in the nonprofit sector, I've seen, there was a shift in terms of the decrease the decrease in the number of volunteers, the ways people volunteer. And I think about that, to me, that's volunteering is such a critical resilience building activity, caring about something other than yourself, and not for any kind of reimbursement or, some sort of payback, so to speak. So it has me thinking about what is the state of our social capital, and what are the ways that we maintain these connections to kind of build that resilience in COVID? What are things we're doing right now to what can we do? So I don't have an answer to that. It's something I'm thinking about.
I'm gonna ask a question, if that's all right. Kale, you talked about money, sort of paraphrasing here, insulating us from understanding what our core needs are at the beginning. And, I think, Jackie, you talked a little bit about what I took away was the hierarchy of needs. So we have some communities that are focused on safety and security and food. And then we have some individuals that have money and all those extra things at the top of the pyramid that the American dream strives for. Our systems are created a little bit by, they're created wholly by the people that have, right? And we talk about the have-nots being kind of the people that are struggling at the bottom to meet those initial needs, and somewhere in the middle is a healthy balance of you've met all your needs of safety and food and shelter, and you're at this place where you're building the community. How do we talk a little, I've heard it a bunch of times on the call, we need to do something different. What do we do, as this group and as society in general, to create that empathy from the people that have that Western culture to actually support the communities within our communities that have not?
It's a good question. I'm sure there's some really great additions here. The first thing that popped into my mind, because I always try and think, like, if I'm looking at a problem, to try and eliminate sort of the outside and to tune in and be like, oh, okay, in what ways am I contributing to this? And what's my sort of piece in this? And one of the things I learned is that I had like a contempt the other way for people with money. And I had a lot of like biases and frustrations with that. And I heard some really, really brilliant advice from a very wise person one time that said, like, money just makes you more of who you are. So the issue is integrity. And the issue is the personal standing in your beliefs and your values. So it doesn't fix the problem, but at least when I look at that, I recognize that, okay, some of the issues I have is like I'm judging these people, which means even subconsciously I'm not being compassionate in the way that I'm communicating with them. So to clear out as much of my own stuff as possible so I can have the most open, loving, solution-focused conversation possible. And then at least that's Kale's contribution to that. And I'm sure there's bigger system approaches and stuff as well, but
I can speak to a little bit about what we're doing at Prime Earth that addresses your question. And from my perspective, a lot of it has to do with educating people about how we are connected, because especially in our society, we have a long history of viewing different groups of people as different. And when you do that, then there's a lot of people who are very compassionate, empathetic people that I have met here in Burlington who say things like, all the recycling I do here makes no difference because there's so many people in China. And that is like a disconnect between the people in China are also people like you here in Canada. And the things that they do in China affect you here in Burlington. And the things that you do in Burlington affect the people in China. And so a lot of our work at Prime Earth is all about breaking down those barriers and talking to people and just educating people on how they're connected to other groups of people, other animals, how they're connected to the environment. Because in my perspective and sort of the the starting point that we come from at Prime Earth is that inherently people naturally have empathy. It's a human trait that we all naturally have empathy. In order to be able to live in a group, you have to understand the perspective of another individual. And it's just layers of cultural conditioning that start to sort of pile up on top of your empathy. And so pulling back that empathy and getting down to like, this is the core of who you are. You're a person who is connected to everyone else on the planet, that other people, that you can easily recognize the emotions and the suffering and the successes of other individuals by looking at yourself in them and looking at them in you. And realizing that you're connected, that we can all start to work together instead of the judgmental, fear-based approach that there's nothing I can do because I'm so small and the problems are so big, or there's nothing I can do because I'm not like them or they're not like me, right? As soon as we start bridging those gaps, that we are all much more alike than we are different. And the differences that we have should be celebrated because they make us able to tackle different problems in different ways and handle more bigger problems than most other animals on the world or in the planet. That makes, those things make us better equipped and better able to be resilient, which make us who we are, which is, humans above all other animals, above all other primates. We are hardwired and designed to adapt and endure. That's what we can do better than anybody else. And the way we sort of maximize those traits that we have is through cooperating and connecting with each other in order to really exemplify the resilience that's already built into our natural systems. But breaking down those barriers and reminding people how we're connected and teaching the people that never knew in the first place that we are all connected. I think from our perspective at Prime Earth, that's how we sort of get everybody back on the same level playing field again.
I wanted to thank you for that. The whole idea of, that we're able to adapt and endure, and that makes us especially suited, to have a strong state of resilience, and the idea of cooperation and connection. And that's kind of our way forward. And kind of, we're at the top of the hour, so I'm mindful of our time, but I think in my work, when I'm working with clients around racism, it's the same concept, the idea of, we need to build that resilience to have difficult conversations. And it applies to come to see each other in each other, and that it is our problem and it is our solution as well. And so I want to thank you. I want to wrap up because we are at the time, but I wanted to thank Dr. Jackie Prime for joining us today. This was such a great conversation, and thank you to Anna and Kale as always, and to thank all of you for joining us. And we will be sharing the recording like we always do, and people have said to me they couldn't make it, and so look forward to the recording, and I think they're going to be in for a treat. So thank you to all of you for your participation, and look forward to a great session next week. We'll be sharing who our speaker is next week, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you so much.
And just one little thing is I put some contact information for Jackie's website and her Facebook page in the chat. If you guys wanted to check it out, I know she has some fantastic, not just like the children's book, but there's great like children's toys. There's great eco-friendly gifts for Christmas that support a fantastic nonprofit.
Yeah,
yeah, really great t-shirts. Eco-friendly, made of bamboo.
Yeah, eco-friendly t-shirts.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.